we will get started. As I said, I'm Tricia Sibbons, Director for Action for Southern Africa. We're 30 years old this year. We were formed out of the anti-apartheid movement because the people that set up and worked in the anti-apartheid movement realised that the legacies of apartheid and colonialism would continue long into the future. And as we have all seen, those of us who are a little bit younger, that is indeed the case. And so ACTSA works with civil society here and in the region, and allies, some of whom are here, to try to draw attention to things that have not yet been addressed, whether you call that reparations or compensation or other kinds of form of repair. Those are the things that we try and focus on. This evening we're delighted to be able to welcome Mr. Barry Mulimba from Kabwe in Zambia. He's come to spend the week with us, and we've had a very productive week meeting various people who are interested in the case of Kabwe and the lead contamination that's there. And so we've been really honoured to have him with us and to hear directly from him, which we'll be able to do this evening, about the impact of the lead contamination and poisoning on the community in Kabwe at large. So to my right, we have a colleague of ours, Zainab Rahim, who works for RAID. She'll talk a little bit about RAID and say what their role is, if you like, as she speaks to us. And just to my left here, we have Dr. Hamza Hamouchene. Did I say that correctly? Hamouchene, who is a writer and activist on the issues particularly around environmental sacrifice zones, and has a great deal to bring to the conversation around that expertise. And then to my far left, Andy Whitmore, London Mining Network, and many other groups and campaigns around these issues. So we're very honoured to have you all with us. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone that's come. Thank you to everyone who might be trying to catch up with us on Facebook. And I'll hand over to Zainab to start us off, to update us a little bit on the legal case in Kabwe, and as far as we know, what the next steps might be on that. But we'll be discussing a range of things, not just the legal case in Kabwe, but obviously the environmental impact, sacrifice zones at large, and then Andy's expertise with other corporates and corporate accountability in the mining sector in particular. Thank you all very much. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Tricia. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, ACTSA, for putting together this really important event. Thank you so much to Barry, who's come all the way here from Zambia to talk to us about his experiences, the experiences of his community and his family. So yeah, I work for RAID. RAID is a corporate watchdog. So we hold companies to account where we can for environmental damage and human rights abuses. And we try different avenues for justice. So the Kabwe case is really a prime example of an ecological disaster that unfolds over generations. It's an example of how corporate abuse can be quite invisible and hidden through the passage of time, and how racialized people can be considered disposable and their environment exploited and then neglected. The effects of colonialism and neocolonialism or neocolonial corporate exploitation really come through this case as well. And I'll just touch on that really briefly. So Zambia was Northern Rhodesia. It was under foreign rule from the 1890s, and then it became a British colony in 1924, until independence in 1964 when it became Zambia. So Kabwe is on what we call the Cobalt Copper Belt between northern Zambia and the south of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the communities in that area were really restructured around mining and extraction. So you had the early taking of land by white settlers, the destruction of peasantry in parts of the country, the creation of the working class, and the banning of indigenous practices relating to agriculture and hunting. And then the lead and zinc rich deposits were discovered in early 1900s, and Kabwe became the site of a major lead mine and smelting operation. And just a point on that as well, the townships that were built around the mine developed very much by the mine's owners, and they placed racialized people in the most undesirable areas. So you had black residents placed to the west of the mine, which is downwind of the mine dumps and the smelter, and then you had large communities of residents and workers by the 1970s living around the mine. So that's just a little bit of history. So Anglo American operated this mine, Anglo American South Africa, which we'll call AASA, between 1925 and 1974, so about 50 years, just keep that in mind. They allegedly had a key role in controlling, managing, supervising, advising on the technical, medical, and safety aspects of the operation of the mine. It was then handed over to the state-owned company, ZCCM, and it eventually closed in 1994. As one of my colleagues said, it was Zambia nationalized its mining industry, but they also nationalized the pollution. How the pollution was caused, so through the extracting of the ore, the processing and smelting. As we said, the smelter fumes send lead dust over the surrounding soil. You have wind-blown dust, seasonal floods, and there's a really large waste tailings, which I'm sure Barry's going to talk about as well, local people call the Black Mountain. You also have 9 months of dry season per year, so a lot of dust is thrown up into the air. And that leads to lead poisoning. So lead poisoning mostly affects women and children. It affects babies and children in their developmental stage, so it affects their bodies, their brains, and their central nervous system. And that's why it's such an intergenerational case, it's such a key case. Children absorb lead 5 times more than adults, and the peak is when they're toddlers at 2 years old. At very low levels, they still have learning difficulties, behavioural problems, and stunted growth because of the lead poisoning, and it interacts in quite a nasty way with anemia. At high levels, you have damage to the liver, kidney, nerve, stomach, coma, convulsions, and even death. And lead is also transmitted through the placenta and breast milk of pregnant women, so there's risks of preeclampsia and miscarriage. And unfortunately, Zambia is going through the climate crisis, of course, and there's food shortages, which means undernourishment. And if there's undernourishment, usually that means that lead is absorbed even more. So blood lead levels have been known to be quite bad in Kabwe for a long time. The World Health Organization says there's no known safe level of lead in the body, but they use 5 micrograms per deciliter as a guideline, above which they recommend medical treatment. Lots of people have visited mine, the areas around the mine. Human Rights Watch went in 2018 and spoke to 60 families. But actually, even while Anglo American was in operation, they were very aware of this issue. So they had a mine doctor called Dr. Lawrence who arrived in Kabwe in 1969. And he noticed an issue with the children in the township straight away, and he tested 500 children. And he was so shocked by the elevated blood lead levels that he went straight to the house of the mine's chief medical officer. It was a Saturday and he just couldn't wait till the Monday. He had to speak to them. And because of his findings, in 1970, Anglo American commissioned doctors from the University of Manchester to go and do further studies, who found the same thing, elevated blood lead levels. And then there was a series of deaths, of young children. And one of the doctors from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine also went to Kabwe and recorded the elevated blood lead levels. So on the legal case that's being brought now, many, many years later after the closure of the mine, the case is being brought by a law firm in South Africa called Mboyise Moleli attorneys with the assistance of Lead International. The demands are the funding of medical monitoring and the treatment of those poisoned by lead. Number 2, the financial compensation of victims. And number 3, the cleanup of the area. The class category is 13 representative plaintiffs on behalf of approximately 140,000 people. That's an estimate based on children who are under 18 and women of childbearing age. Just want to quickly give you an idea of the timeline of this legal case. So it was filed in 2020. In South Africa. there was a 12-day hearing in January 2023 to certify the class action, which means to allow it to go ahead in South Africa. The written judgment from that hearing didn't come till right at the end of that year, so December 2023, and the judge did not allow it to go ahead. So now the lawyers are going through going through an appeals process. They had the permission to appeal granted in April 2024, so of this year. They're currently writing the heads of argument, and then they're going to wait for the legal hearing to be scheduled in South Africa early next year, hopefully. And then, if it's allowed to go through, at that point, it could be 2 to 3 years until the trial, and that would be a good outcome. So just want to highlight that by the time the appeal hearing comes, already 5 years has passed since this case was filed. How many cohorts of 2-year-olds are going to already have ingested that toxic lead poisoning? And some of those effects are really irreversible. So yeah, it's really sad that it's taken this long, and it's that the area should have been cleaned up. And yeah, we could talk more about this through our discussion, but there are comparative cases of environmental pollution. And yeah, I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Zainab. Thank you. Barry, would you like to come in and talk about living in Kabwe and your experience of Kabwe and how the lead impacts your community?
Sure.
Thank you.
Good evening, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. My name is Barry Mulimba from Kabwe in Zambia. I've lived in Kabwe for a period of 48 years. I'm a community leader who organizes the communities and takes awareness on the communities in relation to lead poisoning. And as far as we are concerned as a community, we are convinced that the lead pollution which prevails in Kabwe at the moment was left behind by Anglo American, who were the owners of Kabwe mine from the year 1925 up to 1974. When Anglo American left the Kabwe mine, they left a lot of chunks of lead material or open dumps, and a canal which runs from the mine plant through the townships. These are the major sources of lead pollution in Kabwe. Because of the wind direction, it affects the residential areas which are close to the mine dumps. We didn't know in the past about lead poisoning until some colleagues and the members of the international community came in and started carrying out the tests and encouraging the local people to go for lead. It was not easy to convince the locals to take their children, for instance, to access medical attention, because in our country, extracting blood, people would think you are using it for something else. And so, after a period of time, people were convinced, after seeing that their children and women of childbearing age group started suffering numerous complications, such as miscarriages, giving birth before the 9-month period, until they started now accessing medical attention and medication. That's when we realized as a community that lead was taking a severe toll on the communities. We have we have been assisted by our colleagues from Lide who have taken this case on our behalf in Kabwe as the community. But the major concern we have as a community is the damage the lead poisoning has caused on the local people, especially in the hotspots of Chowa, Kasanda, and Makululu. We feel that if no remedial measures are taken, even the future generations in Kabwe will still fall victim of lead poisoning. It's our appeal, it's our considered appeal that the international community, the human rights bodies would also come to assist us, because we feel very strongly that our human rights are being violated. Above that, because the lead poisoning is causing major problems, especially on the learners. It is affecting their IQ. The learning ability is badly impacted. The learning attention is really bad. It has caused numerous frequency, how do I put it? The kids are not able to listen to their parents, such that even in class, the performance is very bad. As for the women, they have suffered early miscarriages, and they give birth to underweight children. Some of them stunted when growing. And in addition, these kids are born with autism. The parents are not able to access equipment or medication to help the children who have been sadly impacted with lead pollution. We feel that Anglo American should be held accountable for the dire situation they left behind. Because we as Kabwe people have got no means to fight lead pollution. And so we are saying we must be assisted in one way or the other to access justice and redress. The environment in which we live in Kabwe is highly polluted with lead poisoning. Unless Anglo American takes steps to heal the environment, without which the lead pollution in Kabwe shall remain even for the next generation. And we are against that, because we believe strongly that the children who are growing now are our future leaders. Now, if their performance is bad in class, then we won't have capable leaders in the future. I am really grateful to find myself here at the invitation of Action for Southern Africa. And I believe that out of this platform, many people will be sympathetic towards our situation in Kabwe. And perhaps they may even influence Anglo American to consider taking positive action to the children and women in Kabwe who are victims of lead poisoning. If the situation is not redressed, then we are saying that we shall continue to live in a toxic community, and our lives will be sacrificed. So many people have lost theirs, like I've said earlier on, but then we shouldn't allow a situation of that nature to continue. If there are people who can assist us to bring an end to such a sad situation, I thank you.
Thank you.
We'll have chance to ask some more questions about this, so I thought it would be great to just hear from our speakers, and then I'll share some questions. Thank you very much, Barry. So can I ask you to take the floor?
Is it you?
Oh, sorry.
That's okay, yeah. I think I meant to go next, yeah, so that's fine. So, thank you very much, Barry. So, I can't really follow that, but I'll try, and I'll try by doing something slightly different, because I've been asked to talk a little bit more about the background of Anglo American and to kind of set it in context, really. So, as noted, my name is Andy Whitmore. I'm co-chair of the London Mining Network. And the London Mining Network was set up in 2007 to hold account companies who are either based in or financed from London, working particularly with affected communities. So most of our focus has been on certain key large multinationals who are based out of the UK, or they have stock registration here, so that includes Rio Tinto, includes Glencore, includes BHP, although they've now moved almost entirely to Australia, but we're dealing with legacy issues, and of course with Anglo American. So as noted, I mean, we focused on bringing community voices, particularly to the companies. We've tended to use annual general meetings, and for that we've focused around annual general meetings. I think particularly because it's an opportunity to speak to power, to be in a meeting where you can address directly the company. And indeed, I'm a small shareholder in all of those companies I mentioned, so that I can either go to the AGMs and speak, or better still, proxy, so that a community member can speak if possible. So I'm just going to briefly cover three aspects, I think. One is just quick background on Anglo as a company, as a multinational, then a little bit on its origins and history, because I think that really does speak to what we've heard about Kabwe and the long history of the company there, and then finish off with the work that we do around Anglo American. So in terms of background, so Anglo is Anglo American PLC, as noted, it's a British multinational mining company, has its headquarters in London, has a primary listing on the London Stock Exchange, and is a member on the FTSE 100 index, meaning that index tracking funds, i.e. a lot of the major funds, by default invest in it. So according to the Mining Journal's latest figures, Anglo American, including Anglo American Platinum, it's now the 8th biggest mining company in the world with a market value of $39 billion. It has historically complex structure, which has kind of been sorted out slowly over time. Was part of Anglo, or Anglo Gold has moved away from it and merged with Anglo Gold, with Ashanti, to become Anglo Gold and Ashanti, which is now separate, and is linked to De Beers. But basically it is one of the world's largest producers of platinum at the moment, so I believe it's about 30% of the world's platinum output still. Major producer of diamonds through De Beers, copper, nickel and iron ore. And at the moment, many of those minerals are ones that are being associated with the energy transition. So Anglo, along with many of the major mining companies at the moment, is positioning itself to say that it's necessary for the transition. We can come back to that. We tend to have arguments around that, but I think it's important because it's very much an argument in terms of what the mining industry calls its social license to operate, that we as society give it a license to operate, that it's going to be producing those sorts of materials for the benefit of humanity. It also still works with metallurgical coal, so coal for steel making, but it divested thermal coal interest that it had back in 2001. So in terms of its origins, it started in 1917 as the Anglo American Corporation in South Africa. Despite its name, it really is very much a South African company. Historically, it gets its name from the fact that the investment for it came from British and from US investors. So it's kind of interesting to me that even from the start, the focus of its name is around the investment and what's coming into the company in terms of money. I think more than any other major mining corporation, I would say, its history is tied up with colonialism and with colonial expansion. So its earnings really primarily came from South African gold and diamonds using migrant labour, and it was historically associated with propping up the apartheid regime which we mentioned earlier. And I think partly thanks to apartheid, it ended up diversifying into many other South and Southern African, either mining businesses, including coal, but also non-mining businesses. For a while it had a paper company, a property company, it was involved in banking, because when there were sanctions on, a lot of the money ended up staying in South Africa, so there was a need to diversify, even to the point of them owning vineyards. So that's, I think by the fall of apartheid, Anglo American controlled more than half of private industry companies in South Africa. So it's also important, I think, that it was kind of part of a push into the Zambia copper belt or the Northern Rhodesia copper belt. So from 1928, it was part of industrialising that region, again bringing in migrant labour mainly. And even in apartheid time, it had some interest further afield, either in Africa and in Brazil from about 1974. Also historically, I mentioned earlier, it's been linked with the diamond company De Beers, which was formed by Cecil Rhodes. Anglo came in about 27, 28, I think, and basically together they ended up with an effective monopoly in gold for Anglo, and quite a serious monopoly of gold mining in those years in South Africa, but also particularly with De Beers, what ended up as a global diamond cartel. So De Beers controlled about 90% of the diamond trade up until the 1990s, and it was only finally busted by an antitrust class action in the early 2000s in the States. So I think it's got that history. It actually, it shifted because at the end of apartheid in South Africa, that's when it moved its headquarters to London, so 1999. It sold a lot of those non-core businesses I mentioned earlier and kind of reintegrated back into the main global money markets. And I think since then, it's been primarily working on international expansion in other areas. And I think that's where I come to the last part, which is our work around Anglo American. So we've done some work in Southern Africa. We've supported ACTSA and others, particularly around the issue of mine workers from Southern Africa who had historical cases of silicosis and tuberculosis, where mine workers were very often dispersed into their communities to die through not just Anglo American, a number of South African companies. And there was an industry-wide class action which was settled in a few years back, but again, those issues are still being pressed, and again, similar sort of history in a way. It was a case settled, but similar historical legacy issue around health in Southern Africa. But I think now most of our work is supporting communities, particularly in Latin America. It's actually my colleagues that tend to work on that, but historically it's been on Cerrejón coal mine in Colombia, where Anglo was a 1/3 owner. Lots of issues in terms of health, water, human rights impacts. The Minas Crino mine in Brazil, where there's been issues around the dam, water, again, community human rights. Dos Bronces copper mine in Chile, where there's issues linked particularly around operating near a glacier, and Quellaveco copper mine in Peru, with historic issues again, community rights issues and worker issues. And in 2022, we published a report which was based on plenty of community interviews around all of those cases. And the reason for it is that Anglo have been producing various human rights reports around it. What we wanted to do was to counter those reports with community voices. So I think what we've been finding recently with Anglo, and not just Anglo, I think with pretty much all of the multinationals based in the UK I mentioned at the start, is that there's been an increasing focus on environmental and social governance, ESG issues, and that's led to the producing of more human rights reports. Now, sometimes there have been improvements in human rights, definitely, but we're finding increasingly, from our experience, that at community level, we're still hearing some of the same complaints and the same issues. So what we're ending up with is a growing dichotomy between what the company is saying and what the communities are saying. So the purpose of that report was really to try and challenge and come up with recommendations to try and help kind of close that gap. So to me, I think Kabwe is another one of those examples really. So I think if, particularly as companies are positioning themselves now with the energy transition to say we are morally important to where the world is going, it needs to provide the minerals the world needs for that. There is an increasing moral case that we should be holding those companies more to account. So we will continue doing that, and I think this is a really, really good case again where there's a strong moral argument to deal with a historical legacy issue. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah.
First of all, thanks for ACTSA for convening this event. Glad to be here to show my solidarity with Brother Barry, with the communities of Kabwe in their struggle for justice. From what I read and from what I heard today, clearly the perpetrators of these health and environmental crimes needs to be made accountable. They need to pay reparations, they need to repair and redress the injustices and the damages made. That is clear. Myself, I'm from Algeria, I'm from North Africa. I work for the Transnational Institute. My focus and my expertise is on extractivism, environmental and climate justice in North Africa and the Arab region. I'm no expert of Zambia or Kabwe or Anglo American, but I'll try to make parallels just to show that what is happening in Kabwe, or what happened in Kabwe, is not an exception. It is endemic and it is fundamental to the inner workings of the global economic system that we live under. And that global economic system is called capitalism. Capitalism is a system of unpaid costs. It always shifts and externalize the cost somewhere else. It externalizes the cost to women and carers in terms of women's work, and care work is either unpaid or underpaid. It externalizes the cost from urban to rural areas. It externalizes the cost from the north, the global north, to the global south by creating the so-called sacrifice zones. And that comes through mechanisms of racialization and otherness, but also it externalizes costs to nature. The capitalist system always wants to dominate nature, to plunder nature, to commodify it, and that creates the ecological and climate crisis that we are seeing at the global scale. One modality of the working of capitalism is what we call extractivism. And that modality is, how can I say, the specificity of the peripheries, mainly the peripheries and the global south. What does extractivism mean? Extractivism is a capitalist mode of accumulation and appropriation that has been unleashed all over the planet since the 15th century with the European conquest of the Americas. And as you can imagine, that process has been shaped by plunder, by slavery, super exploitation, ecological destruction, blood, through the plunder of silver and gold that came from Latin America at the time. But extractivism in strictly terms is about the extraction, the mass extractions of resources for export to international markets. And those resources, usually they come in raw form or processed just slightly. And that creates dependencies on the global markets while externalizing those social, environmental, and health costs to the peripheries, because those costs are not integrated in the price of the commodities sold by those companies. And extractivism is not just oil, gas, and mining. You can find it in agribusiness, you can find it in tourism, you can find it in intensive farming, and also intensive fishing. And from the field visits that I made, North and South Africa, and there are other examples we could talk about, the Congo in terms of the cobalt mining, why? So that on top of the environmental destructions that you see around, the pollution, the prevalence of diseases, you see what some people call the development of underdevelopment. Like the benefits of those natural resources, of that wealth, is not reflected in the surrounding areas. You see lack of jobs, you see underdevelopment, you see environmental destructions, and this is, on one hand, you have the wealth of natural resources, and the other hand, you have all these uneven developments, destructions, lack of jobs. And this is the paradox of extractivism. That's how it works. It creates sacrifice zones with sacrificial people where their bodies, their health, their environment, their water are being sacrificed in order to maintain the accumulation of capital and the accumulation of profits for tiny elites and tiny corporations and companies. And I've seen that everywhere. I've seen that in my home country, Algeria. I've seen that in sites of phosphate mining in Tunisia. I've seen that in sites of silver mining in Morocco. And I've seen it lately in sites of coal mining in Southern Africa. So I think we need always to think in systematic way. These companies need to be made accountable, but it's about changing the development model that would work for the local populations. And just one last point in terms of how extractivism works. It works through, as I said, racializing the others. That's why it is acceptable to create sacrifice zones in the peripheries or dumping sites where companies dump waste and poison, because those people are disposable, as what you said. They are disposable. And in the world that we live today, when genocide is accepted and is supported by the Western imperialist powers in Palestine, these mates need to be linked. Genocide, ecocide, these things are linked. It's about that system, the imperialist capitalist system that creates all that destructions. And those corporations, either Anglo American or BP or Shell, they are part of that system of creating injustice at a global scale. And struggles needs to be linked from Palestine to DRC to Zambia to South Africa to Morocco and so forth. Thank you.
I just want to ask Barry if there's anything else, having heard the other speakers, Barry, is there anything you'd like to draw on that Whit said, or that Hamza or Zainab said, that you'd like to draw our attention to before I open it up to questions?
Thank you very much. I think my contribution at this stage is we realize as a community that the lives of the children and women are at stake, because their lifespan has been shortened. The children are dying prematurely because of the lead pollution that has gone through their bodies through ingestion. Our appeal as a community is that even here where we are seated, we have some influential personalities who can help us access justice. We are a community who have no means at all to access medication for the children that have been found to have elevated red blood level. And so, if this meeting does not come up with some kind of resolution for us to consider that we are being helped, then the children of our communities shall continue to be victims of delayed poisoning and early deaths. I thank you.
Thank you. I want to see if anybody has some questions for anybody on the panel or some comments that they'd like to make, and then if not, I'll ask the panel some more questions. Okay, we'll go around the table. Welcome. Just please say who you are.
I'm still a journalist from Anglo American, also I think I might write state advice. Wanted to ask you, what's the Zambian government position in all of this? Because someone will argue that they also have responsibility. What's your view, and are you guys negotiating with the Zambian government? What are the next steps?
Is there anything that the Zambian government have promised the community, or are you in negotiation with them at all?
In as far as I'm concerned, I have no idea at all whether or not the Zambian government is doing something in our favor, except that I think there have been some interventions through the World Bank. The canal which was open has now been concretized, and some houses in Kasanda Township are some pavers placed in their yards.
So some covering up
Yes,
of
the
open
surfaces,
area
yes.
in one township.
In one township.
Some houses.
Yeah.
So there has been some funding to cover up, I think. Yeah. Somebody else has some questions?
Yeah, just following up on that.
Just say where you're from.
Yeah, my name's Leo. I come from Accountability Council, it's an organization focusing on representing communities affected by internationally financed projects and leveraging that experience to work with the boards and management of every single multilateral loan banks in setting up their internal loan traditional payments like this and insurance fit for purpose. So just back on the back of that question, the World Bank, so a little bit sort of briefing here, it was a $66 million loan to the Zambian government in 2017 that closed a couple months ago, which from my perspective, kind of coming from the perspective of dividends, redress, and revenue for the community, that in a way opens up a redress channel because the environmental social safeguards of the World Bank applies. And I was wondering, I mean, I appreciate that no one is technically on the field to you will all put out and very informed. But I was wondering if there's any kind of cohesive strategy that would consider that channel generally. And then if I can tackle on the second question, again, I know no one here is a lawyer, but I was wondering if you could give us a flavor of any sort of arguments that will going forward and combine with what are the main arguments from Anglo American, which are A, that they're 10% shareholding, that they were treated with vice member, and then two, kind of the hurdle of time bar, given that it was 50 years ago, which was something that they wrote.
Okay, so I'm going to take that as two questions.
I think so, yeah.
Zainab, could I ask you to talk a little bit about Anglo's position as we know it? That would be great. And then Would you be prepared to pick up the World Bank loan issue?
Try, yeah.
Best you can. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so in terms of Anglo American's kind of key legal arguments back, first of all, yeah, they say they were a minority shareholder or they were just an investor. The lawyers say that this is actually a red herring argument. It's irrelevant under Zambian common law, which follows English common law. They say it's actually about how a multinational parent company can be held liable for harm arising from its overseas operation and the extent to which they knew and the extent to which they intervened. So it's about parent company liability, and they have a case that there's a few cases that have set precedent on this, legal precedent on this. There was a 2019 UK Supreme Court hearing, also a Zambia pollution case, Longo and Vedanta, which was based on alleged negligent management and supervision and advice, and that was allowed to go ahead. So that's one of the arguments. The second argument was that it was passed on to the state-owned company, ZCCM, which is true, but Anglo American relieved themselves of the responsibility due to nationalisation, but they still don't explain what they did when they were aware of the serious public health risk, how they handed that over, and failed to remedy the situation. Also, interestingly, they sat on the ZCCM board, so even though they handed it over, they were still on the board of directors. Their employees were seconded to ZCCM, and ZCCM sought engineering advice from Anglo American while it was in operation. So it was never that they just left and had nothing to do with it anymore. And the final argument is that they say it's not fair to apply the standards of today to the 1970s, and the lawyers say, well, killing children should never have been. It's never part of the standards of a company anyway. So that's quite a weak argument.
I think in addition to that, there were some medical reports that Anglo itself commissioned, and there were some recommendations for relocating people and cleaning up the topsoil, and those two recommendations were rejected. So there's quite a body of evidence, if you like, at the time, in the 1970s, that remedial action that could have been taken was not, and so the contamination has been left. There's certainly been more contamination since Anglo left, but the point that the community are making is that this has been laid down in the topsoil. We had the benefit of hearing from Stephen Bose-O'Reilly, who spoke yesterday on a webinar on the previous day in the House of Lords, who is a medical expert and has been to Kabwe many times. And so he really laid out the kind of breadth of the tests that had been done and the various things that they had discovered over time, and how the ingestion of lead is a generational issue, as Zainab said at the beginning. So there isn't a way of drawing a line and saying, oh, it wasn't us, it was them, or it wasn't us then, but it's them since. Those things are just not, they just don't stand up. And I think the other point that was made before we asked Whit to respond to the World Bank loan, keyword loan, which Zambian government's going to be able to pay back.
With interest.
Before we go there, I think the other important point is just to say that that we've known in the West that lead is dangerous for a very long time. So even if you knew in 1975 or in 1980 that you left a mess, you could have gone back and cleaned it up, but you chose not to. And so that's a level of kind of dismissive, in a way, environmental racism, which I think Hamza is pointing to, a sacrifice zone. We'll take the profit and we'll leave the mess somewhere else, where in a community that doesn't have a voice, I think as Barry quite rightly relayed, that they're hidden. It's not an area that people go to. It's not a tourist town. People don't know about this case. People don't know about this long-standing issue, and it's only since the case has been legally brought that it's come to more global attention. And so, really, this is it's. I mean, some of the work has been in the legal frame, and we're not lawyers here. That's not the point. The point here is there is a moral responsibility and a moral accountability. You can't just take profit and leave a mess. And so I think these are the things that are drawing us together as civil society in support of the community. So yeah, I think Zainab's kind of updated on that Anglo thing, but just those key points about moral responsibility. It was known at the time, and you shut the door on it, and maybe you hoped nobody would find it, but that's not the case anymore. So, Whit, over to you.
Yeah, sure. And I think I would say that from London Mining Network, we try and support this case when it's come to London. We're not part of the kind of key teams who are making strategic decisions in terms of advising the community. So it's difficult for me to say whether that's being looked at as an issue, as others know. I mean, I personally wasn't aware of that. I mean, if I was looking into it, I think look at all options where it's possible, including public finance first and then private finance in terms of what the potential leverage is. But I guess here, given that there's an ongoing court case, I think it's certainly worth looking at, but given that there is an ongoing court case, it's probably best to concentrate on this first. But I think certainly in other cases we've worked with partners like Accountability Council to make sure that communities can access that redress through the World Bank, and it is useful given they have those mechanisms there, but I think they're certainly a softer version of what's happening here. So yeah, but probably worth having a chat with you later, if that's all right.
I think it's also just worth coming back to the point about how many years this should go on for. So how many more generations of children is it okay to get sick and to not fulfill their potential, or how many more miscarriages are okay? And there's that parative question. We wouldn't tolerate it here. We wouldn't tolerate it here. So those parities are very, very important if we want to see a kind of more equal world, a world that isn't so unequal that people are literally dying of something that a company listed on the UK Stock Exchange has left behind. That's the reality of what we're. So I don't want to get away, locked up in the argument of the law, the legal case. This is really around why is it okay for these sacrifice zones to be to go on. Ma'am, please introduce yourself.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Aline Alaris, previous council for basically, my interest is just, the right of the children, mothers especially. Now we have a new government, especially here with the Labour Party, the Minister for Africa. I'm not quite sure who that is, but
Lord Collins.
Yeah, okay. So, and we normally have an MP who is all
International Development.
yeah, who we can petition to pick up, because I think it's absolutely important, because I know if one child at a school was, thought to have, say, got lead poison from within the school due to old pipes or anything, that school would have been shut down with immediate effect. For years it's been happening, as I have read and I've understood and I've been following. I don't think it's indeed right that this should continue. So I don't know if what we can do here, as we said, we're not lawyers, but it's all about petition and hammering at the door, say here, because it's where we are and people are here, for us to do, just saying, getting to that minister and saying what we do and see where we're going forward, because it's no use people going round and round in circle and waiting for this legal aspect, but pushing forward. Because often time when we're waiting for this legal aspect, we can sort of gather what's likely to be about. When you do look at the demographic who are suffering, and oftentimes the demographic who are suffering, they have no, it's like they're just needed for one thing, and is to get the best of that country, and they don't care to who it's about.
Barry might like to respond, but I know that you've said already they're looking for support for, not from us necessarily in terms of, we want to amplify the story and amplify the experience, but there is a need for medication for children whose blood levels are already in excess of 5, which are many, 45 is the average that we were told. So families can't afford that medication, and the World Bank grant doesn't cover medication. In order to determine who needs medication, there needs to be proper blood measuring. There's no electricity in the area where there is a blood measure machine, but no electricity to run it. so that is not able to help. There are a number of interventions that could help immediately start to recognise this issue, and then to draw in, as you were saying, to leverage and to draw in a larger strategy. But it's who's going to go first? Who's responsible for going first? These are the questions I think that we need to be asking our government and Anglo American. Barry, do you want to come back to that?
No, I think it's very important, of course. We can't allow a situation where the children will continue to lose lives, okay? If we had the means for the victims to access medication, I think that would be much better. Well, the problem here is that the parents of the children who have laid in their blood are not able to take to access medication because it's not there in health centers. Okay? And the machine to examine the late victims, I think, was just installed recently. Like you rightly said, we have load shedding for long hours. We only have power for a period of 3 hours.
So I just had something just to say. So I think you mentioned new council. I think it's difficult in some ways for us to try and elevate this with the company as individuals, but certainly many of us are probably accidental investors in Anglo American, and I think certainly local councils have pension funds, etc. Because, as I mentioned, start with FTSE 100, lots of those pension funds will probably be invested in Anglo. So I think one potential way to try and put pressure on the company to do the right thing is if we can, to approach those pension funds to get them to lobby the company directly, because obviously as more major shareholders, I mentioned I've only got a couple of shares, but those are the people that the company is more likely to listen to. So that's just, that's one option, I think. Maybe others, even if you have we probably have individual pensions, we can probably contact our own pension funds as well. So again, it's different points of leverage, but I think it's all about trying to apply where we can.
Hamza, do you have anything to kind of recommend in terms of, building a campaign, building allies, things that have worked in your experience in this sort of case?
I have more questions than advice. Are there any scientific studies linking the diseases with the lead poisoning?
Yeah.
There are. So it's a strong case.
Lots of medical evidence. Yeah.
So I think that's the way forward. Using that evidence in court and bring those accountable.
I think that's what the lawyers are doing. Yeah, thank you. Comments, Tony?
It's more of a comment than sorry, I'm Tony. I'm connected to ACTSA. I'm on the council. It seems to me that in the legal process, if I got it right, we hope the appeal wins. But even if it does, it's 2 years. So at the moment, Anglo American might just be hoping the appeal doesn't win. But in reality, whether it wins or not, there's still 2 to 3 years. And in that case, more people are going to get it, more people are suffering, and it's back to the moral case. Now, it strikes me from some limited experience with Anglo American and some others, some South Africa, that they will never, ever, really, unless they're forced to, accept liability.
Exactly.
The lawyers and everything else. But the more we can make it clear, whether the legal case wins or not, and we hope it wins, and we'll be supporting that as much as practically we can from here. If it doesn't, the public campaign continues, which makes the moral case. Because at some point somebody has to do something about the environmental debt, which means the more people continue to get lead poisoning. And somebody needs to be doing something now, and certainly needs to be doing something years ago, about the people who've already got lead poisoning. So who is that? And that's what I think an argument we can make. It shouldn't be the community, it can't be the community. So who is it? Now, what the mining companies do is walk away. Not us, but somebody's got to do it. And I think the more we can get that out, if the legal route works, great. I give it, but if it doesn't, the campaign has to continue, because otherwise, Barry or others from the community could come back to a room like this in 10 years' time and we'll still be hearing it.
Yeah.
So we've got to make that moral case and the public case wherever it can be as strongly as possible. That may, and I'm not that hopeful, push companies into, I mean, there was a big class action on silicosis in South Africa. The class action was eventually settled, wasn't decided in the court. The companies involved came to some kind of settlement, which means they don't admit liability. But from the community side, personally I'd like them to admit liability and take everything they've already got. But on the other hand, what I want is justice for the community.
Yeah.
So that.
I think justice for the community, and that takes a number of forms.
I think what you've said is like very eloquently. Legal settlements are not ideal because the company does kind of get away with it in a sense, but it does mean that the victims are not dragged through the courts for another 5 years. If the area gets cleaned, hopefully you'd hope in some of the more innovative settlements, the area is cleaned up. There's a medical program and it can go on for, you can set the number of years in the settlement. Sometimes that's made public and sometimes it's not. But I think it's probably the quickest way that remediation can happen and cleanup can happen. And as this lady said as well next to you, in terms of if this had happened in one school to one child, it would have been a scandal. This happened in Flint in Michigan in the USA a few years ago. You probably remember it was about 10 years ago. It was under the banner of Water is Life, where lead poisoning entered the water system when they changed water sources, and that went through a legal case and that went through a settlement, and the settlement was massive and it was for much lower blood lead levels than what we're seeing in Kabwe. But I think there's still a process in terms of who people accessing that compensation and how it's kind of distributed. There's still issues around that. But I mean, it's another great example of environmental racism, because Flint, more than half of the residents in Flint are African American. There was a risk taken on the water sources, and it was a complete disaster. You'd hope that this was treated with the same urgency.
So to add a recap, there is a question over there.
Oh, there is a question.
Oh, no,
Okay.
sorry.
Okay, Luca, do you want to go first?
My question is more just based on, Luca, I work with great students. I'm trying to understand the reasoning that Anglo American is for the legal case. You mentioned doctors doing tests just before they were nationalized, before they were transferred to the Zambian government. Did knowledge transfers also happen? Because this reminds me of France leaving Guinea, where they destroyed all the infrastructure and that sort of stuff. And in that way, they managed to claim that their sort of tenure in Guinea was finished. Does the same thing sort of apply here? Were there knowledge transfers? And then to what degree is Anglo American trying to blame this on the Zambian government? Because they did operate it for 20 years after the fact. And you could claim that it was used in the national interest. So,
Great question, Luca. In terms of the first part, knowledge transfer, I guess it's just back to the point which Trisha made, which is there were recommendations that were made by those who came and investigated. They were commissioned by Anglo American themselves, but those recommendations were just not taken on board. They were ignored and they left with some fingers in the pies. In terms of the nationalisation, I mean, it is a way to kind of absolve themselves of responsibility. I think some of the mining industries were re-privatised, and Anglo American played a role in that. So there's a lot of contradictions going on, I would say. But I don't know about knowledge transfer specifically, what that would have looked like.
Anglo were still involved, I think, for 20 years after an actual technical nationalisation. So they definitely had, and that's part of the case, that they were giving engineering advice, they were previously responsible for health and safety. So if they didn't transfer, I mean, if you were the Zambian government and the company said, you know, okay, you're renationalising, but look at this pile of contamination that we're going to leave, which is locally called the Black Mountain, the Zambian government would have said, you need to clear it up, surely. So you can kind of make your own judgment around what knowledge or liability was transferred knowingly, shall we say. So what was transferred knowingly. Yeah, that's how I would answer that, best I can.
Yeah.
Clive?
Thanks, Tricia. Thanks, everybody, for what you said. Clive Sheldon, I am a lawyer, not an environmental lawyer, but I do have some experience of working in the dynamic where there's a very powerful private entity versus a community organisation that's sort of trying to protect a position. And in that context, I was operating as a lawyer, but the people I was working with and advising were very astute and used public relations and press and media very, very effectively. And it seems to me that, you know, in addition to the legal case and political representations, I'm just wondering what steps you're taking to engage that other element around media and public relations, because in the case that I'm referring to, where I was working, that was what became the most powerful tool. So I just wonder if you could speak to that.
Certainly building the campaign has become more of a priority. The part of the problem is not knowing when the case is going to be, the decision in the case and so on, so you kind of gear up to get public information and public awareness, and then something happens in the case and you can't do anything. But besides that, I think the point that that's changed me since meeting Barry is the realisation, you know, right in your face, that this situation is affecting everybody right now and will do so regardless of the case. And so that's the issue I think that we need to kind of coalesce around in terms of a campaign. We have developed an open letter that went to Anglo American this morning. If you haven't already signed it and would like to, that's our first step, is to say actually this needs to be sorted out. And so you can be in touch with us on our website. You'll see on our socials how to get part of that letter. But we'll be talking to Barry and the community to work out with them what they would like us to do next. Because I think that's very important to build more allies.
I'm sure we can take some of this offline, but I would just suggest thinking more about the story than the campaign.
Point noted.
It's such a powerful story, but to build the story, because a campaign has a particular flavour to it and can be a turn off for some people. If it's a story, and here there really is an engaging story, it's a terrible story in many ways, but in terms of bringing leverage, certainly.
There are some materials already. Al Jazeera visited about a year ago. There's a documentary online that you can see on our website, and also the Children of Kabwe website, which collates a lot of the material locally and internationally. And there is definitely more interest in that. Question at the end. Two questions at the end. Which? Go on.
I'm a doctor by background and have done some humanitarian medicine. I was wondering whether there was any involvement from international humanitarian medical organisations, partly to solve the problem now, and also kind of on the point of the story, actually the more respected organisations are still kind of widely respected in media and by the general public, and actually their voice can be quite influential, whether in this particular situation or widening it to other environmental crises.
It's a very good point. Thank you.
Just
We'll come back to Whit at the end.
just one comment on the fact that I work in media and I try to pitch this story for for a few editors, my editor and someone else, and they were so fixated in the case. They asked like, but what's the news angle? Because nothing has moved. It might take years, so what's new? and they didn't want to take it because of that. So I've been thinking how to push the narrative beyond the legal case and tell the story of these people that they don't know who will come and help them, and they have no voice. And so just an advice that sometimes for the media they need something that is immediate. I don't know how to sell it to them constantly.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason for bringing Barry here, is
Yeah.
because we want to try and say there is a story here who is interested in listening and then assisting that to be amplified in international, in international circles. But it's not the only story, as we will well know. But we do need now to because Anglos are listed here. I think in London there is something that we can do. Yeah. Was there another question? Otherwise, I'm going to ask Whit to
Just,
comment.
yeah, sorry. Didn't want to block anyone else, but just coming back, I think primarily to what Tony was saying, and in terms of what we could possibly do now. I was interested now, I hadn't really thought about it, but we've been struggling with these question and legacy issues for a while. Indeed, we produced a report that was called Cousin Run, that was basically about these historical legacies that mining companies had made a profit, but when things had gone wrong, kind of how to hold them to account. But just to say, there is a kind of precedent in a way over the situation in Bougainville, which is where the British company Rio Tinto ended up with a mine called the Panguna mine in Bougainville, which was causing such pollution that basically the local people rose up. There was a civil war, the company had to leave, and long historical issues of this abandoned mine. And over time, effectively moral pressure has led, and some excellent allies, including particularly the Australian Human Rights Law Centre, that have forced the company to join with the community to do a human rights impact assessment. They haven't yet admitted, and it's just going through its final stages of being agreed with the communities. But the purpose of it, obviously, is to identify what the problems are so that the company, which hasn't promised yet to do reverity, but the idea is it will. So I don't know, again, whether that sort of sets a precedent that it's something that can be done now, because the argument was, that something could be done in 10, 20 years' time, but meanwhile these people are living near abandoned pits, etc. So, action needs to be taken now. So that's hopefully something that maybe a precedent could be used.
No, I think that's a good point. And, it could be, part of the call to Anglo in the last couple of days has really been to kind of, live up to the promises you make on your website that you will repair or contribute to where you contaminated in the past. And that's really the call, is, to live up to that promise and begin to enter into a setting where there is some joint responsibility, either with ZCT or others, but certainly laid down that topsoil 50 years ago, that mud sticks, frankly. So, you can wriggle for a while, but for how long? And it will just be worse. The longer you leave it, the worse it's actually going to be, and the more children that will suffer. And is that what you'd like to be, known for, as opposed to a mining company of the future, which is one of their claims? So thank you for that. Any closing comments or observations? All welcome to. Anything you'd like to say, Barry, before we close?
Yeah, yes, please. I'm glad that the majority in this meeting are ladies. Imagine if your child or your children were victims of lead poisoning. Imagine you are in Kabwe and your children are victims of lead poisoning. What would be your reaction? Which way would you consider to take this matter up so that the attention of those that have been found to be culprits, can provide justice? That's the way we want to look at it from, okay? That if you had children who are victims of lead, what would you do? Please find a way to help the community to recover, and we'll appreciate that a lot.